Okay, nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, good
Right
meeting
on.
you too.
Cool.
Thanks for coming.
I brought you some samples.
Great.
How'd I do?
You did great. Look at that. Your card's all filled out. Beautiful samples. Nice job.
All right. Awesome. You got a few minutes? I could ask you some more questions about CWD?
Yeah, you bet.
All right, let's talk about it. Thanks so much for joining me for a few questions.
For sure.
I'd love to know a little bit more about CWD. Why is it important that we should know more about CWD?
Well, CWD, as we've learned from the experience of other places, is a really serious disease that's impacting deer, elk, and moose populations across North America and elsewhere. And unfortunately, as we've learned through these experiences, that it can have some really significant conservation level impacts with declining population, but it also has a more immediate impact on hunting and hunting culture. And so I think that's really important for people here in BC. And we have an opportunity here, based on what we've learned from other places, to stay ahead of it and to be proactive in BC. And so if we can work together, I think we can really make our best effort to minimize these negative impacts on the populations.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about how the disease impacts or affects the animal?
Sure. So it's a prion disease. So it's actually an abnormal protein. It's a misfolded protein. It accumulates in the body of these animals, and it ultimately will accumulate in the brain and the central nervous tissue. And so it causes a neurological disease, damage to the brain, which is also always fatal. And so, I mean, it's not a pretty disease for these animals.
So what do some of the symptoms look like for a deer that may be suffering from CWD?
One of the challenging things about CWD actually is that infected animals often appear perfectly healthy. It takes a long time for the symptoms to develop because the disease is caused by a protein. The body doesn't recognize it as something that shouldn't be there. So there isn't an immune response that they would have with, like a bacteria or a virus. And so these animals can be infected and moving around on the landscape. They're capable of shedding the disease agent and spreading the disease, but we don't usually see sick animals infected with CWD in the wild. So that is a challenge because there's no signal for us that there's something wrong with these animals. But we do know through some research, like captive animals in a research setting, that at the very late stages of disease, when the animal has experienced that damage to the brain, then they'll start to exhibit symptoms like the extreme wasting and neurological symptoms, poor coordination, trembling, drooling, things like that. That usually happens at a very short period at the end of the disease. And again, we don't typically see that in nature. So that's why testing is so important, because if you harvest an animal or there's roadkill, there's no signal for us that animal could be infected. And so we have to collect those tissues and send them to the lab to confirm so we know.
Cool. We'll talk about testing a little bit more, but how is the disease spread from one animal to another or yeah?
Yeah, so it can spread a couple different ways. I mentioned the infected animals will shed the disease agent through their bodily fluids, so saliva, urine, their feces, a carcass decomposing on the landscape. All those prions can get into the environment a number of different ways through that shedding. So animals can pick it up through direct contact with other animals, grooming one another, things like that, nose-to-nose contact. But they can also pick it up from the environment. These prions can be on the surface of plants, in the soil, even in water. And so animals can pick it up indirectly that way. And so that environmental contamination is another really challenging thing about this disease, because once it's in the environment, those prions will persist there for several years, and there isn't any way that we can clean up those environments. So, the best approach is to try and limit that environmental contamination and stop that cycle.
Can you freeze it or burn the prions to take them out of the environment?
Unfortunately not. Prions are essentially indestructible. They are resistant to, disinfectants. They're resistant to UV radiation, to burning, to freezing. And so that's why they will persist in the environment.
Okay, so it sounds a little bit scary, as to say that there's not a whole lot of options. What is our best option for containing or managing the spread of CWD?
Yeah, and again, we've learned from experience of other places that when CWD enters an area, for the first time, like in a new area, you have a short window of time where you can be effective at containing it geographically and suppressing or slowing the rate of transmission and spread of that disease. But what's super critical there is that you detect it early, right when it's introduced to an area, because once it establishes and gets into the environment, we start to lose the effective management options. So detecting it really early is absolutely key to that. And if you can do that, then we do have some tools to limit the spread and to limit transmission within a population that's affected.
Okay. Now, has there been, no, we have some occurrences of CWD. Can you tell us in general what we know so far about CWD in British Columbia?
Yes, so we have been doing surveillance in British Columbia for chronic wasting disease for a couple of decades now, just trying to be proactive and test, working with hunters mainly to get those samples, to get those first cases. So in 2024, we confirmed our first cases of CWD in the Kootenay region, in the Cranbrook area. And so since that, we really have ramped up surveillance. Thanks to the hunting public, hunters that have submitted last year over 82% of samples. And so that has provided us with so much excellent information so that we can understand what's going on. So currently we've detected a total of 6 cases in that region after testing over 4,000 animals. So that tells us that although we now know it's there and it's absolutely a concern and we need to act on this and respond to it effectively. But the data is showing that it's in a very small proportion of the animals right now. And so I think we're in that window where we could try to contain it and slow it down.
Now, what are some best practices for hunting in some of those areas where we have detected CWD?
Yeah, so hunters are absolutely key to this. Hunting is the most important management tool for CWD. So hunters have a really vital role at a number of different steps. First of all, when you harvest an animal, understanding the risk, understanding that these animals and the material that you're transporting around can contain prions. So understanding those risks and following best practices around how you're handling those animals and disposing of parts that you're not going to consume or put on your wall. That's really important because, even when CWD is in a system, we definitely want to avoid any unintended transport of those materials to new areas of the province, right? So just knowing the risk of moving carcasses around the province and making sure that those animals are tested, both for that peace of mind for the hunter, but that information, those samples and that data is critical for us to help inform our approach so we can understand what's going on. And it just helps us to make smarter decisions on how to manage this disease, where to focus our efforts. So yeah, hunters are critical at multiple steps.
Okay, so best practice, leave everything you don't intend to eat at the kill site or nearby, and then we want to remove samples. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about removing samples today, and tell me about that process of what it looks like to, if you're receiving a head, what you're taking out of the head to inform the samples.
Yeah, so we have to look at specific tissues when we're testing for chronic wasting disease. We're targeting those tissues where those prions are going to start to accumulate. And so whether it's us receiving a head from a hunter or a hunter collecting his own samples in the field, what we're looking for on the deer is a specific lymph node at the back of the throat and the tonsils. On elk, moose, and caribou, it's a little bit different. It's that same lymph node at the back of the throat and a portion of the brainstem right at the base of the skull called the obax. So those are the tissues that we need for testing. Whether that sample is coming to us at one of our testing facilities, we can extract those tissues and submit those to the lab in Abbotsford for the diagnostic test. Or hunters can collect their own samples, submit them to one of our freezer locations, and then we'll receive those and get them to the lab for testing.
Cool. Now, are we just testing animals that we're finding in the areas that we already know there's CWD, or are we looking beyond?
We are actually testing animals across the province. Because we've had these detections in the Kootenay region, that is our focus and our priority. But the disease could pop up anywhere through the movement of an infected carcass, whether it's from somewhere in BC or from elsewhere like Alberta or Saskatchewan. We know that those carcasses are moving, and so that presents a risk to anywhere in the province. The disease can also move around on contaminated plant material like hay or animal feed. And so again, that could pop up anywhere. So we're really encouraging hunters to submit samples from right across the province, so that we can stay ahead and be proactive in those areas.
Okay, so if I've submitted my samples, which I have here, when will I hear back from the government as to the status of the deer? Or what?
Yeah, and thank you for that. We, of course, we're trying to tighten up our turnaround time on results as much as possible. We recognize that that's really important for hunters, and we're doing everything we can to make it as efficient as possible. Right now, we fortunately have a lab in BC that's running the samples at the agriculture lab in Abbotsford. Once we submit tissues to that lab, they have committed to a 2-week turnaround to get those results back. So when we get those results, we post them on our website, all the negative results, we post it on the website, and the hunter can access the results that way. If we ever got a positive case, we're going to contact the hunter immediately and directly. That's why the contact information on the card is so important, to let you know that that's happened. Fortunately, we've had very few cases so far in BC, and so we haven't had to make a lot of those calls, and we hope to keep it that way.
Okay, so in a situation where I get a call from Kate saying, "Hey, Dylan, your deer from the Kootenays has CWD. What's the next steps for me? I've got a freezer full of deer."
Yeah. So, I mean, that's not a conversation that anyone wants to have, obviously. The recommendation from public health is that infected animals aren't eaten. And so it's entirely up to the hunter on what they want to do. But the public health authorities, they recommend that meat is not consumed. And so we request that the hunter turns it over to us so that we can have it incinerated and it doesn't end up on the landscape. But again, it's totally up to the hunter. And the other thing too, just around these conversations is although it's devastating, you've had your hunt, you have a freezer full of food. It's so disappointing when a hunter finds out that an animal has come back positive. But I try and relay to those hunters that they have done more for managing CWD in this province and protecting these populations than anyone else, because they've removed that infected animal from the landscape. And so we really need hunters to keep hunting animals in these areas, because again, just the act of hunting is the most important management tool to help us stay ahead of this disease. So
awesome. So by testing, by hunting, collecting those samples, bringing the heads in, bringing the samples in, is that our best avenue right now to fight this disease?
Yeah, I mean, we have to work together. It's really going to require a team effort, and it's incredible that we have such support from hunters across the province and the hunting and trapping organizations that are at the table helping us to guide our strategies, as well as our First Nations partners. Like, we've got everybody at that table trying to build and implement a CWD plan for BC that everyone can get behind. And I think if we just continue to work together, we continue to learn, by accessing these samples, and we can adjust as we go. But doing it together is really the key.
Amazing. So if no doubt people have more questions, where should we send people to find out more information around CWD and managing this disease?
Yeah, so we have a few different resources out there. The BC government has a website where we post a lot of information. Hunters for BC have just recently published a new website, cwdbc.ca, which is going to be an excellent resource that's really tailored for hunters.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And you might see a video from us there talking about sampling as well as deboning deer in the field. So great. Thanks so much for doing this. I've learned a lot today.
Great.
And I hope folks out there have learned a bunch too.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dylan.